Hello again. This is Joe Caton with AARLCC, and we are here with Tony Bolden. He is the author of Groove Theory, the Blues Foundation of Funk. As we go through these books in South Florida Book Festival, we're looking into all kinds of conversation pieces, and this book certainly is a conversation piece. Here it is, Groove Theory. Now, I'm speaking to our author and a good guy to give us some insight into what exactly is this thing. So I'm going to start out by introducing and asking Tony if he can tell us, is it possible to even define this thing called funk? What is it and what is its meaning? Tony, would you pull us in on that one?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you for having me, and I appreciate all of your work. Funk means a lot of different things. The word has a lot of different definitions within it, but in terms of the music itself, when we talk about something that's funky or what the funk is, has a long sort of traditional meaning in among Black musicians and dancers and so forth. So at the core of it is emotional sincerity, truth, honesty. At the core of it, that's what the word actually means. But when we're talking about style, then, to perform in a way that an artist is demonstrating his and or her complete emotional honesty, right? So that's at the core of it, that's what it means. But it is difficult, it has a lot of different intricacies involved in it.
And tell us real quickly,
does that make sense?
As far as the concept of relating this or connecting this to Black culture, how does that come into the picture?
Well, that's a long story. I'll make it as short as I possibly can. So the word has at least two different histories, or etymology, sort of the etymology of a word. So it has two different histories. One is English that goes all the way back before the United States was formed, but the other one is African, or at least there are probably two, but there's at least one African source of the word. So the word is always in both of those different locations, both of those different histories. The word has always been related to smell on some level. But the Black definition has to do with performance. So, so if someone perspired, that was an indication of that particular musician having performed in an sort of honest way, like letting it all hang out, so to speak, putting the funk in it or the stank in it, as it were. But you see, so that's it's more to it than that, though, because it's also connected. The term funk, or what we call funkiness, is also connected to other aspects of the culture, because the music is related to dancing, and very much so, and also the way we talk. It's actually about a style. So it's really a concept that has to do with style in Black culture that's related to African sort of, to what we made of African culture when we got here.
I see. Sounds like it's quite intricate, like you said. And now, one of the things you say in the book is that the word funk, it either used to be or can be construed somehow as a bad word. How does that exactly fit in?
Well, it was for a long time. It was a bad word. You couldn't say it. In Let's Take It to the Stage, a song, by Parliament Funkadelic, they actually say it. Funk used to be a bad word, and you couldn't say it on the radio. You weren't supposed to say it in public. There's a poet, a writer named by the name of Jabari Asim, just to give you an example, by the name of Jabari Asim, comes out of St. Louis. He has a beautiful poem. I can't remember the title of it, but he has a beautiful poem about the funk. I think he wrote it last year, but he's also an essayist. And in one of his fairly recent books, he talks about growing up. Now, this is somebody who's on the scene right now, right? And he talks about growing up in St. Louis or the St. Louis area. And he said one word that his father would not allow, I think his father was a teacher, but he said his father would not allow anyone in the house to say was funk, right? So well, why is that? Well, one reason is because we have to understand Black folk, traditionally are very religious, contrary to stereotypes and stuff like that. Particularly the people who lived on the land and those, who migrated from the South, very religious people. And funk rhymes with that other F word that I won't say, right? It'd be too polite to say. So it actually, if we go all the way back, one of the definitions, like I said, it has a lot of definitions. One of the meanings of funk was the smell associated with sex. So that's one reason why you weren't supposed to say it. But it also had to do with a kind of down to earth, a kind of, like let it all hang out sort of expression that had racial implications. So for people who are, let's say, 45, people who are 45 and under, for people who are 45 and under, the word Black used to be a bad word too, for the same reason, right? So, so there were certain stigmas attached to Blackness. You're supposed to say Negro, you're supposed to say color, you weren't supposed to call somebody Black. Well, funk is very much related to that, so it had all these negative kind of associations with it. And the fact that the word is somewhat innocent now is part of the reason is that those funk musicians were so great. James Brown, Parliament Funkadelic, Ohio players, Rufus and Shaka Khan, Jimi Hendrix. All of these were great artists. And because they were such great musicians who actually talked about, as songwriters, they wrote about the concept, they philosophized about it. And because they were so great as artists, the word lost a lot of its stigma.
Very good. And now there's this connection that I also made between funk and blues. Now, blues is its own story, as we understand, but how does that connection come in? Or what is that connection between blues and funk? Because it's part of your title is the Blues Foundation of Funk. What's the blues part of this?
Yes, sir. Well, we have to understand that funk is a concept that Black people created, right? you know, that the music that we now understand as funk came much later, right? And in many ways, the concept of funk that people created was in response to the stereotypes, you know, that white people created. So blues musicians, blues dancers, they were the ones who really created and developed the concept of what we understand now as funk. It's actually related to an African religion called hoodoo, which is a whole different thing. It's essentially what, you know, in the old days, you know, Black people who were brought here performed the ring shout, or what they call the shout. It was performed in a circle. And I guess what the more recent version would be the holy dance. But you can't, the funk is the secular component of what happens in the church when the church gets happy, right? And so, but the blues people were the ones who developed this. There's Bessie Smith, the great singer and songwriter and poet, Bessie Smith. Bessie Smith, there's a story about Bessie Smith that I tell in the book, where there's a birthday, somebody gives a birthday party for her, and in her hometown of Chattanooga, Tennessee. So this is 1925, long before, you know, any of us were thought of, long before the funk musicians themselves were born. And she hears, you know, a piano player. You know, in the old days, they would actually play live music for your birthday if you had that kind of clout in the culture, right? And so there was a piano player that she could hear, and she was feeling that music. So the story goes that she turned to, you know, her two girlfriends that were with her, you know, in approval of the music. And she said, the funk is flying. So the blues people were the ones who developed this concept, right? And so the actual funk musicians who came along later on applied it to a new style. But the concept of funk is very old. Jazz musicians use it too. There's songs in the 50s called Opus the Funk, Blues the Funk, Montgomery Land Funk, Blue Funk. Ray Charles, everybody's heard of Ray Charles just about because of the movie, you know, Ray. Well, Ray Charles wrote a composition titled Blue Funk, which was my original title for the book. That's a whole different story. They said that wouldn't work. But Ray Charles actually wrote a song called Blue Funk. Heavy D, you know, the rapper, Heavy D, he had an album called Blue Funk. So the musicians have understood this for quite some time. It's just taken, you know, the writers to sort of catch up, you know, for a while. So that's the connection between, you know, blues and funk. It's a conceptual connection. People who play music will say, you know, can explain, you know, some of the musical parts, but funk music is a mixture that includes blues, and blues is the foundation of jazz, and it's also the foundation of rock, and it's also within the context of, you know, soul music. So it's related musically too. So it's sort of like the glue to that. D'Angelo says, I quote him in the book, and one of the things he says is that when somebody asked him why he's playing, you know, a lot of funk in his new album, which was the Black Messiah, I think. And, you know, he said, well, with rock and soul and all of that, blues is kind of like the glue to it. So that's the answer to your question.
And there's got to be some point in time when funk music would have been, I want to use the word at its peak, but is there a moment in time that you can think of that, if you want to call it that, that funk was in its time, it was in its prime, at its peak? Is there a particular time in history that we can pinpoint that as?
Well, let's see. I suppose I don't want to get in any trouble because you really there were various styles within funk music.
Mm-hmm.
All right, so Prince played funk. That's really in the 80s. In the time and all of that. But so I would say the foundation, let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. One of the things that Maurice White, the founder of Earth, Wind and Fire, a drummer by trade, also a great singer and songwriter. But one of the things that Maurice White said in his autobiography, if we just talk about Prince, he said that there would not be any Prince were it not for Sly Stone.
Sly Stone.
So the musicians Sly Stone, right? So the musicians of the late 60s, the funk musicians who created it. So we're talking about James Brown, we're talking about Sly Stone, we're talking about Jimi Hendrix. And an argument could be made for the Ohio Players. But those groups that came along who created the style, the godfather of soul, James Brown, came up with the notion of the one, the first hard beat in a 4-beat measure. So you get the rhythmic structure from Brown, who led his band as a dancer. That's really important because he wasn't really a musician in the way we understand that. So it's really these musicians who create the foundation of the aesthetic itself, of the way of the attitude, the criteria, the way of looking at, the sort of the standards that they would use. So I would say those musicians who emerged, some of them we don't know their names, and of course the dancers who were important, very important dancers. But these people who identified with the funk in the late 1960s and early 1970s, I would say, give us a foundation. You could say maybe the mid 70s would probably be, sort of a high point, of what we might call the funk era. But again, you have musicians who come later on, or musicians who are around in the 70s, like Gap Band, who really, who become more popular, in the late 70s and early 80s. So.
Very good. Well, that makes a lot of sense because the music is moving as some of the artists are moving and as they are evolving as well, because things are changing as we're going along. There is another issue I wanted to bring up, and that is we often make this connection between funk music or the music of its time and the civil rights movement, because after all, funk is something sort of steeped in Black culture. Is there some sort of an influence that either the civil rights movement had on the funk music world or vice versa? Tell me what kind of a connection you've been able to see in that as you did your research on this book.
Very good. Very good question. So think about it this way. Funk used to be a bad word. We've established that.
Right.
It doesn't cease to be a bad word. Well, I'll put it this way. Funk music, as opposed to soul. So we, in the late 60s, early 70s, we actually had two forms of rhythm and blues, two different forms. Like today, you have relatively few different forms. At that time, there was a lot more diversity musically, right? You had a whole lot of different styles of jazz too, right? And you had the blues, and you had gospel, and so forth. Well, funk music is really the story of how masses of Black people felt about whatever measure of freedom that had been attained by the civil rights movement, because it's important to understand and keep in mind the Voting Rights Act, which is, like a central aspect, central event in the civil rights movement. That's 1965. So the movement really goes to the cities after that. Before that, the emphasis had been in the South, in these Southern towns, right? And the whole struggle was to be able to get to vote. After 1965, the emphasis goes to the cities where people actually already had the right to vote, right? So the issues were a lot more complex. Funk music tells that story. It is the story of what it felt like to have achieved some added measure of freedom to say what we had to say, to express our feelings, our emotions in the ways that we saw fit, right? At the same time, it was a comment on what the civil rights movement had not been able to achieve. Yeah. So it was also a comment on the lack of freedom. And sometimes the artists, these songs, there's a whole lot, there's escape in the song. So today, a lot of the writers talk about Afrofuturism. Well, Jimi Hendrix is talking about that, in a number of his songs. Third Stone from the Sun. You got Sly Stone talking about, I want to take you higher. And then George Clinton, gets a spaceship called a mothership, right? So, but this is connected to what's happening in jazz as well. John Coltrane had a song, had a whole album, a suite, what it was called Ascension, And then if you didn't get the hint, he follows this up with Sonship. And of course, there's Sun Ra doing all of these things, since the 1950s. But at the core of it is a commentary for, freedom, the idea that something isn't right here in this space. And there's almost a kind of creative impulse to imagine a different world where people can be free, right? So it's both the expression of freedom and a comment on the lack of freedom that had been achieved, by the activists themselves on the ground.
Very good. Now, there are a couple of things in terms of the artists of the time. You you feature a couple of them, and I'd like to just ask a thing or two about them. One of them is on the cover of your book is Shaka Khan. And that was one of those she was one of those artists that made funk music what it was. So my question is, in terms of Shaka Khan, what was her significance in the emergence and development of funk music?
Well, the reason I wanted to put her on the cover, we often associate funk with James Brown and George Clinton, and that's all well and good. They were great, but women were part of the funk movement also, and Shaka Khan really exemplifies, sort of personifies in many ways what it meant, what the style was all about. When Black women, were musicians and artists, and she paid a terrible price for it. Before her time, notwithstanding, Tina Turner, but for the most part, before Shaka Khan, to express, for Black women to express sensuality in the way that she did, was a no-no. And now, when we think of the artists of today, her style seems pretty tame. But at that time, it was a big change from the Motown, from the Motown images that had come before her. So she was called the Queen of Funk, and or she still is called, the Queen of Funk. And of course, she was, arguably the most talented singer of that time. She's certainly among the top one or two. Even her story of how she becomes a singer, because she doesn't come out of the church. She didn't grow up singing in the gospel, singing gospel music in the church. So she really is a kind of autodidact, right? She's someone who develops a distinctive sound and a distinctive approach by basically studying the music in the largest sense possible. This is very much a product of Chicago, of the music of Chicago and the venues in Chicago, the talent shows, so the Emotions were the famous group. The Emotions were, sort of rivals for her and her sister, whose name escapes me at the moment. But yeah, so I think in a lot of different ways, Shaka Khan exemplifies, what we mean by, the funk aesthetic.
Funk aesthetic. And there is another artist you mentioned in your book. In fact, you have a chapter on him, and that is Sly Stone. Now, Sly Stone kind of fills in a chunk of, if you want to call it the history of, or I call it the development of funk music. So tell us about his contribution, the Sly Stone contribution to this. I've seen, in fact, a number of people talk about funk music around the events that took place as they were working with Sly Stone. So tell us how you brought that into the book and what was the significance there.
Thank you. Well, Sly Stone was very, very important. he isn't discussed a lot today for reasons I don't quite understand. But incidentally, I think Shaka Khan's sister is named Taka Boom. But Sly Stone, so he influenced, I mentioned that, there's no such thing as Prince. We can't imagine Prince without Sly Stone. But he influenced Miles Davis, the great, Miles Davis, who was an innovator in 4 different decades. He influenced Herbie Hancock to play what we now understand as jazz funk, right? That, Herbie Hancock said that he was listening to Sly Stone, and even wrote a song and entitled it Sly as a tribute to Sly. I had talked about funk being kind of like a negativity. Herbie Hancock talks about that because, he said, well, do I want to play this music that's been frowned on and so forth and so on? And he began to listen to Sly Stone, and he decided to defy those kinds of stereotypes, because of Sly Stone. So there are a number of different, another artist that I write about is Betty Davis. He influenced Betty Davis with, she cites him. Rufus, the band Rufus itself, the people, I don't remember the names of the original band members, but they said that they were inspired by Sly and the Family Stone. So, so within the context of funk music itself, Gap Band, Charlie Wilson said that Sly was his model. We could go on and on. Oh, one last thing, to give you an example. So, at least for this point, the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense in Oakland. Sly was based in San Francisco, but his music used to be played on a radio station called KDIA Lucky 13. It was an AM station, and just about everybody who was Black in the Bay Area at that time listened to that station. And so you would also hear the Black Panthers on that station. They would come on and they would say what, different things that they were about, they were doing, and so forth. Well, Ricky Vincent, the pioneer who wrote about funk, really talks about how the Black Panthers had a funk band called the Lumpins, and they played Sly's music during live programs. Now they would change the lyrics up, but they would play Sly and the Family Stone, and Sly Stone was the songwriter for all of the music. So Sly Stone was really important. However, no one had talked about him. In my book, what I've tried to do in this book is explain, my basic question is, how is it that Black people develop this concept that we call funk? And then, how did this concept get developed into a musical style? If that's the question, then you can't really leave out Sly Stone, right? And so Stone is really central to the story that I have to tell. And I could go on, but that's the sort of, in a gist, that's the answer to your question about Sly Stone. Oh, one last thing. So earlier I mentioned that James Brown created the concept of the one. And of course, this music has been sampled ad infinitum, right? This is really the early soundtrack for hip hop. But Sly Stone, his role in funk as one of the co-creators of funk, co-architects, if you will, Sly Stone was responsible for proselytizing both the attitude, the sort of bohemian style, the movement away from the suits and all of that, right? But he also was one of the people who began using the word itself in live performances. He would say, he would talk about the meaning of funk and how it would do you no harm and so forth and so on. But, and he also used it on one of his, on at least in liner notes on one of the album covers. So he was central to all of this that we're talking about.
Very good. I thought so. So once again, ladies and gentlemen, the name of the book is Groove Theory, The Blues Foundation of Funk. One last question as I let you go here. Today, we talk about music as it evolves over time. Artists come in and they do different things to music genre. Tell us, as we're going away here, funk music over time, who are the people that's driving that now? What is it now? What does it look like now? And give us some sense of who are the front players in that genre of music right now.
Well, the genre itself isn't as influential as it was, but the concept is very much is quite evident. So just as blues musicians dealt with the concept in different ways, and jazz musicians dealt with it. So you have certain artists today who exemplify that aesthetic. Kendrick Lamar comes to mind. He's very explicit in some of his songs on Pimp a Butterfly. There's Erykah Badu, who engages the concept in various ways. But in terms of like right now, for your listeners who are a little younger, I would say Megan Thee Stallion. If you check out Betty Davis and then look at what Megan Thee Stallion, listen to her songs, what she has to say, her whole aesthetic. There's a really important, I think, an important connection between Betty Davis and her ethos, her cultural values, what she was about. Because Betty Davis was sort of, I don't know that we would call her a feminist as such, but she addressed issues related to women, particularly Black women, and more particularly Black women who lived in street culture, right? A lot of the scholars and the novelists of her period in the 70s, they dealt with, either women who lived long ago, like, in the 20s or before that, or they dealt with, Black women who lived in, sort of the whole intellectual thing. Nothing wrong with that. But in the here and now, the women who dealt with, like the street culture and hard house parties and all of that, clubs, Betty Davis was the one, who really championed these women. She was talking about, sex workers, which is the term today, years and years before, a lot of the feminist theorists of today were either born or began writing about it. She was talking about, these women in championing, or at least addressing the issues pertaining to them. So in ways that I think were very insightful also. So I think, I like to think Megan Thee Stallion and Kendrick Lamar are two people, that come to mind. Jasmine Sullivan is also important, just from a purely artistic standpoint. I like Jasmine Sullivan as well.
Very good. Well, thank you very much, Tony, for joining us at the South Florida Book Festival. We're doing this remotely, and we hope to get a chance to meet up with you in person when things change and we can actually get out there and shake hands again instead of doing the elbow bump or anything like that. But it's been a pleasure having you. I'm sure this is great reading. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, the book is Groove Theory, The Blues Foundation of Funk. Tony Bolden is the author, and thank you once again for joining us.